Bolivia. Bolivia has a very ancient history, and it was important that all the members of our expedition should learn about it. So we went to Tiahuanaco to see this pyramid and evidence of the ancient Tiahuanaco culture. Here Oswaldo Rivera told us something about it. Oswaldo is the senior of Bolivia's small number of archaeologists, and he came with us from Lake Titicaca southwards on our expedition. He told us that Tiahuanaco was a very ancient culture and dominated the area around Lake Titicaca from something like 1400 BC to about 1200 AD, some 26 centuries. Here was a raised platform on which priests could hold ceremonies, and in various ways the people of Tiahuanaco could worship their gods. All of it in beautiful dressed stone, no mortar, but beautifully fitted together, as can be seen in other sites in Peru and Bolivia.
You're going to hate me for panning so quickly.
They even had sound amplification systems. Here Lee Smart and Mark Lobel are testing the arrangement. What happened was that a priest in the center could perhaps chant, and people could hear amplified the sound of that chanting. The people of Tiahuanaco were very highly developed. They grew potatoes and were able, even at the height of 13,000 feet, to make them edible by a sort of special arrangement of catching the sun's rays during the daytime and storing the heat in raised mounds. In the sunken quadrangle here were carved heads, and in the middle a statue of Kontiki, the great god. And here's the temple of the sun, through which at the sun's equinox rays would strike a temple. The greater part of Lake Titicaca belongs to Peru, and about 5 out of its 6 major tributaries come in from Peru. So Peru is quite important, and that is why we understand that the Bolivians and the Peruvians have made an agreement, taking 20 years to do so, whereby they will use the waters of this lake sensibly and not drain them away in irrigation schemes which might alter the level of the lake. Lake Titicaca has only one outflow, and that's the river Desaguadero, which we were going to go down all the way to where it more or less ends up at Lake Poopo, 250 miles to the south. This was the hut in which we stayed, and here Lee is getting on with a little bit of drawing of the reed boats that we were going to use. Reed boats built by the Qatari family, Maximo and his son Eric, who owned this hotel in which we stayed, and where out of the Tortora reed they made these boats.
Well, this is the starting point of our journey, Lake Titicaca, 3,820 meters above sea level, and it certainly makes you puff and pant when you're walking up down the steps from the lake shore. Here it is that Eric Qatari and his father Maximo have built our fleet of reed boats. Using local Tortora reeds, they fashioned our craft, which
we had 3 in all: the flagship Kota Mama and 2 smaller ones, Viracocha and Pachacotec. We weren't going to launch them on Titicaca. We were going to drive round and launch them at the entrance of the river Desaguadero. This is Titi Cat-Cat, or as John preferred to call him, Titi Puspus, our temporary mascot.
It's Friday the 13th, lucky number, and we're tasting the sail. As you can see here, it's a purple one. I think it's Apachitas. No, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. This is Viracocha. It's the maximum or the highest god of the Aymaras.
One of the great problems was the portage of these 3 reed boats. We were already aware that the effects of El Nino had meant that the Rio Desaguadero was low in water. We might not be able to navigate all those miles south to Lake Poopo. So we were going to have to arrange for portage along the way at some point. To start with, we had the assistance of some young Marines who train on the shores of Lake Titicaca, where Bolivia keeps a lot of its navy. We even borrowed a lorry from the Armada Boliviana, and here you see it taking the boats to the outflow point at the town of Desaguadero, where we were able to unload the reed boats. Of course, another problem was that the boats, after some time in the river, would get waterlogged and even heavier. One of the things that we were interested in was the possibility of trade links between the high Andes around Lake Titicaca and the Atlantic Ocean. It's not impossible that ancient peoples used boats like these on some of the rivers that flow eastwards down from the Andes into the Paraguay River and the Paraná and out into the Atlantic at the River Plate. This we hoped in the second phase of the expedition to test out by doing something of the same sort in reed boats like this, though perhaps even bigger.
Whoa. Very heavy.
After several weeks, of course, we got quite good at loading and unloading the boats. We got the technique right of passing a great spar of wood underneath them, and with jerry masters shouting 1, 2, 3, lift, we were able to get them in and out with some ease.
We saw last Saturday a motorbike arrived at this place.
John and Oswaldo discuss the route ahead at the rather dreary little town of Desaguadero, which is on the Peruvian border. We held a ceremony here for the launching of the boats, attended by His Excellency David Ridgway, the British ambassador to Bolivia, where the boats, here are 3 of them, were blessed by a local priest, and various speeches were made to a rather bemused local populace. We didn't want to launch the boats whilst all our guests were present. We waited until they'd gone because we feared some sort of drama, but apart from drifting rather aimlessly across into some reeds on the Peruvian bank seen opposite, everything went reasonably well. And the boats soon got underway with a good following wind billowing their sails. These were great days when we could actually sail with somebody operating a steering oar in the stern and good progress being made. The Desaguadero winds rather aimlessly through banks of reeds in its upper reaches with interesting geological features in the background. And for some of us it was a pleasant ride, but of course things soon went awry. Storms were apt to blow up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, lightning would strike, and various dramas ensued. We ran quite quickly into shallow water, so it wasn't a question so much of punting along as pushing and pulling the boats over sandbanks. There was one awful night as we approached the town of Erojito, where the weather worsened And although the boats were visible from Hirohito, and they could see John's Range Rover headlights shining, there was some doubt as to whether the fleet could get in that night. But one of the local men, the alcalde, rowed out in a boat and led the fleet into the correct channel. But it was quite late that a sodden and somewhat dispirited group finally reached Hirohito. It was at Hirohito that we made an interesting discovery. A local woman told us that her plough occasionally struck rock in the middle of a field of coca. We prodded about with spikes and eventually found this amazing pedestal, and nesting against the foot of it two figures that are known as chachapumas, which are a half man, half puma, which were used in ceremonies by the Tiahuanaco people. Oswaldo told us that these probably dated from about the time of Christ, long before the Spanish came. But the Spanish, of course, being good Catholics, didn't like carved figures of half men, half pumas, and so they smashed them up. These are very badly damaged.
This is not in a line. This is a little moved. It's not east, west, north, south oriented. And all the architecture of Tiahuanaco is shows an orientation.
There were two others in a little museum at Hirohito here by the river, and there are some in Tiahuanaco itself, but not many. So this discovery was valuable. The figures have the head of a puma and the body of a man, with the right hand holding an axe and the left hand the severed head of another man.
This is the belt. This is the arm and the fingers. This is the axle. This is the another arm and the human head. The one shoulder, another shoulder, the arms catching the axle, another hand catching the human head.
Christopher, no, Lee rather.
Well done.
We tended to live in whatever buildings were available wherever we arrived, very often school buildings, as here at Hirohito. Sometimes the alcalde's office, sometimes out in the open in tents. The great thing was to get clothes dried after terrible rains had wet us through in the afternoons. From Hirohito southwards, the river was still pretty good and navigable. Sandbanks here and there, but often a deep channel leading round them. But often the wind died, and we had to be towed, not by a horse, but by one of the crew members. Sailing these boats became harder and harder work, and sometimes a very tired crew slept for a very brief time on the banks, to be woken at 5 a.m. to carry on just as before, dragging, wading, pulling, pushing, and getting pretty wet through very early in the day. And there was still a lot of river to go.
How's it been this morning? What's been happening? Fairly well.
Captain Lee Smart and our youngest Bolivian member, Alexander, sometimes had time to relax.
Hola, Alexander.
We reached Nazakara, but storms threatened. Here we were able to stay. Every village or town we reached was very hospitable. And at Vichaya we even had a special ceremony of welcome laid on.
Thursday, March the 19th. We left Iruhitu about an hour and a half ago.
All the time we were aware of the stark beauty of the Altiplano. Not absolutely flat, undulating, but virtually treeless and featureless, with all the time in the distance, on either flank, the Cordillera of the Andes. Here live the Aymara people, with their llamas and their vicuña and their fields of quinoa. A pretty desolate place.
Let's see, over. Said Mum, I'll make sure I have my red flag to take that plough on over.
Under the cloudy sky was always a slow, sluggish river, choked with weeds and barred by sandbanks. Occasionally the wind was favourable, but it was sometimes difficult to get ashore. Shallows everywhere.
Hello, Petrus, Kota. Did you copy the last message from Rover 1, over? Right, we're going to slow down then and wait for you to catch up.
It was at Aguayamaya that once again we had to stop, and this time to portage. Lee Smart and Luke Cox became pathfinders. God knows what the llamas thought watching us from the banks. The journey from Nazakara to Vichaya, which we'd planned to take in one day, actually took two, and a great deal of pushing and pulling and slogging was necessary to achieve even that. It was at Vichaya that Osvaldo found the remains of a 4 or 5 million year old creature, the Glyptodont, which was a primitive form of armadillo.
Or a giant armadillo.
Giant armadillo.
And it was found in this square?
Yes, and these disappear at the present. There are no more of these animals now.
So what was this about 5 million years ago?
8 years ago, found it whilst he was tending his cattle over here. But he didn't tell anybody for a long time, and then a year ago he told the schoolmaster, and they realised it was important, and so they put this fence around it, and since then it's been visited by quite a few people.
Right then, where are we? On top of some mountain somewhere in
From
Bolivia?
Vichaya we moved south to Calacoto, where the river Mauri joins the Desaguadero. We hoped here that a tributary would bring in more water and make the river more navigable, but it wasn't to be so. We stopped at Calacoto for some time because nearby, on high mesas to the west towards the Chilean border, were a number of interesting sites that John had noticed on his previous records. And so we climbed 2 or 3 times to the tops, flat tops of these mesas.
We are in this moment at the top of the flattened, one of the flattened hills at 13,100 feet above the sea level. And in this portion we have a ceremonial part. We have so many buildings. Maybe some of them are burials, and another could be houses of the ancient people. Maybe this is a defensive population, and like this hill we have so many other hills, more or less 30 hills. They are from the Aymara culture. We call the Pacajes region this place, and
where there were what we thought at first might be houses, but which proved to be burial chambers. Burial chambers of a people that came after the Tiahuanaco people, but came before the Inca people. For 200 or 300 years, the Pacajes, known as the Eagle people, lived along the banks of the Desaguadero on the high Altiplano, and they buried their people in elaborate stone charnel houses on the tops of mesas. Luke Cox and Elsbeth Turnbull and others climbed to the tops of these mesas, from which an amazing view of the Altiplano below could be had and the distant volcano of Sajama.
With a stack of bones inside.
And we found in these charnel houses, known locally as chulpas, a whole lot of bones, not many skulls, but femurs and radii and ulna and all sorts of rib cages and other bones from the human body. The chulpas each had a little narrow doorway facing east so that the early morning rays of the sun could strike the bodies that had been interred within. The corpses were often tied up in fetal positions and wedged into grass baskets known locally as canastas.
They found some of them had heavy injuries to their chest, and there's this one young girl.
Some of these burial chambers had an underground compartment cut out of the solid rock.
They used to bring the kids up here to sacrifice.
Jason Joyce investigates.
What's interesting here is that the actual bottom two.
We worked out that in some instances a local chieftain had been buried with his wife and maybe half a dozen concubines to keep him company in the next world.
So if there is another foot down,
An extraordinary black and white lizard. We didn't come across much wildlife, plenty of vicuña, the occasional fox. Otherwise, just lizards, beautifully camouflaged like this one. From some of these chulpas, the skulls had been taken, perhaps to sell to medical students, but in others, in more remote areas that we visited, there were skulls aplenty.
It's amazing that you said there were young bones and things.
Over 50 chulpas on top of one mesa.
Why they were young, in perfect order. Why they're bones.
Attachments of tendons, some quadriceps muscles, no signs of arthritis, rickets, or any other disease.
There's young.
Young adult. This is the left side of pelvic girdle.
We found it rather strange that there didn't seem to be any evidence that people lived up here, and yet the whole mesa was ringed very strongly by defensive walls. They revered the dead so much that they thought it necessary to protect them from outside interference. Dry stone walls,
So this is where they think
hardly any gateways,
dynamite
beautifully defensible.
kept as a lookout point.
On one of these mesas, we found a tunnel entrance, and so Luke Cox abseiled down to see if he could get into it. Its purpose was unclear, but he did manage to penetrate right through underneath the top of the mesa to the other side.
Are you spinning?
He's now got a foot edge.
Yeah.
Yep, he's on. He's on the ledge.
You see. We'd heard tales that over on a mountain to the south of the first city, there were some extraordinary painted tombs, and we went off to seek them. And indeed, after a fairly short search, we managed to discover these buildings set inside an overhang under a cliff.
Tunnelway.
And they were indeed painted.
Oh.
Inside the tombs there were sepulchres containing skeletons and body bags in which skeletons had been held at some time or other, but had probably been pulled out by wild animals. And behind the tombs there were tunnels going back into the mountain. Most of them were blocked up with sand, but we sent in a team of intrepid Royal Engineers to examine these and to map what we found. This was very important from the point of view of the archaeological evidence that we would take back to La Paz. Inside the tombs, there were very few funerary objects, but on the outside walls there were paintings depicting what appeared to be possibly boats with people in, and also a design which looked like a step pyramid, similar to that found in Mexico and, of course, in ancient Egypt. We sent Yolima in, as she was one of the smallest, and inside the tombs she was able to hold up one of the body bags and examine it more carefully. We believed that the people who had lived and died in this area had probably been royalty, and we deduced this from the shape of the skull. They were elongated, and this was something that they practiced in those days, and it was caused by putting a board upon a child's head to elongate the skull from birth, and this was a sign of royalty. This was a most exciting find.
Su nombre quiere saber. A ver, pregunten. Yo me llamo Marco. Me llamo Juana.
Name is Juan.
Juan?
Her name is Juan.
No pronuncia.
That's
Su nombre.
nombre.
Sí.
Juan.
Juan dice, pero en inglés parece que...
John. En inglés, John.
Sí. Yo me llamo Juana y en inglés es John. ¿Eh? Aquí hay un John en quinto.
I don't know. Marco, did you say?
Marco.
Marco.
Marco with C.
M.
M-A-R-C-O.
Oh. Español. Marc, inglés. Marco, español.
Gracias por su visita. Queremos que nos colaboren y que no se olviden de nosotros. Queremos tener buenas aulas.
One of our projects was to invite some of these delightful Bolivian children to speak by telephone via satellite to some Spanish-speaking youngsters in Britain. We had a link with the Brixton Community College, and it was astonishing for some of these young boys and girls who maybe hadn't seen a telephone before to find themselves discussing things with children in Devon. Do you play football? How are Leeds United doing? And other such important issues.
They speak Spanish naturally, so I imagine that they'll be... Okay, anyway, there's a little boy to speak to you first of all. I'm handing him on now.
Aló, buenas tardes para allá, buenos días para aquí. Está bien, sí.
¿Cuántos estudiantes hay en tu colegio? Yes.
Everywhere we were well welcomed, and here the village schoolmaster at Calacoto is thanking us for the help that we proposed to give them in the way of some new classrooms. After Calacoto, the journey began again. Yet more river, but yet tougher prospects because of its increasing shallowness. In fact, we had to leave our flagship, Kota Mama, the largest of the three boats, behind and proceed downriver just with Pachacotec. The composition of our boat's crews changed as we went down the river. We'd had to say goodbye, sadly, to Sebastian Shepherd and to Barry Moss, and Jim Masters and Ben Cartwright, who had manned the Avon at the start, in fact switched over, and it was Ben and Lee Smart who brought it in the end. But throughout there was Maximo Catari and his son Eric and their cousin Alexander, and Sergeant Freddie Ramos of the Bolivian Navy. The nights we spent on shore, we had to cater for ourselves. We had dehydrated rations for that and excellent volcano kettles to heat up water for hot drinks. Probably better than relying on Bolivian food. 20 people crashing into some small village demanding food must have put a tremendous strain on the locals. They tended to produce for us some impenetrable piece of chicken wing mounted on a heap of rather cold rice with a bit of salad and some lukewarm potatoes. Not terribly appetizing. I think we did better at the hands of Jerry Masters. Jerry Masters and Noel Burrell between them took on the main burden of our cooking, and jolly good grub it was too for the most part. The nights were cold and often wet, and we needed good food. The support group tried to follow the river party along the bank. It wasn't always easy because, of course, there are no convenient roads running parallel all the time. We often had to strike inland long distances and come down to the river some way further on. Once or twice we were able to ford, other times there was an ancient ferry to carry the boat across. Of course, the support group had to recce ahead. John and Yolima very often went to the next town or village down the river to work out where we might stay and how the local alcalde and his people would react. Generally, a good welcome was found.
Some more firewood. Oh, he's bending down to get some more. Brilliant.
Easter came, and miraculously, Jim and Jerry and Noel and the rest of the support group team produced pancakes on Shrove Tuesday.
Jim, have you had a lot of training with pancakes? You had a lot of training with pancakes.
But it soon became apparent that the river was running out. As we drew nearer to Lake Poopo, it got shallower and progress was harder.
Yes. Yes. No.
We decided that we would have to abandon the journey at a certain point when it became impossible to drag the boats very much further. One of the three boats we managed to get back to La Paz, where it now is an exhibit in a children's museum and much enjoyed.
Yeah. I couldn't see that.
By the international bridge, which carries imports from Chile up to La Paz, we flew the Explorers Club flag. After a while, it became unclear whether this was a river journey or a walk in rather wet circumstances. We'd proved that the Desaguadero just about can still be navigated, though its days, perhaps, as a river on which boats might ply are probably numbered. And so, to the firing of pistols and the letting off of firecrackers, we said goodbye to the river journey. The last hauling out of Pachacotec, somewhere just short of Lake Poopo.
Well, this is the symbolic end of the boat journey, and I'm sure you would all want me to congratulate the Qataris on building boats that are as resilient as this one has been, and indeed the other two. For boats made of natural material like Totora to be able to survive and get this far is really pretty remarkable. And I think it's a great credit to Maximo and to Eric and indeed to Alexander for the work they did before we got to Bolivia on these boats. Obviously, I want to congratulate the boat's crew. Many of us here have taken part in the cruise. A lot of people have been in the support group. There's been Jerry slaving away with the quartermaster's team, helped ably by the doctor and so on. But we've all been a team, whether we are from Colombia, as I say there's only one representative, from Bolivia or from Britain. I believe that we have worked together as a team in getting this one boat through and indeed getting the others as far as we did.
Pienso que la integración que ha habido entre la gente del Reino Unido con la gente boliviana.
After John's farewell speech, Lieutenant Vladimir Terrazas gave his thoughts. He was pleased, he said, to have been part of this expedition, how we had done a great thing for Bolivia in proving the navigability of the Desaguadero, and how he hoped that we would have good fortune in our further investigations of the eastern side of his country.
Let's have 3 cheers for the Tiahuanaco. Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray!
Okay. Well, empty.
The Bolivians do propose to make certain important engineering works, to dredge the river perhaps, to make it a little deeper, but this lies in the future. We've been lucky to have good liaison officers, Vladimir and Freddie, and a very good team of drivers, Ruben, and Antonio and Juan Carlos had all played their part in this expedition. And we hope that some of them will be able to join with us in phase 2 from July to October 1999, when an even larger boat made of totora reeds will navigate the Paraguay River and see if it's possible for these sorts of things to make their way down towards the Atlantic. We'd found many things on the first phase: the chachapumas, the chulpas, the evidence of the Tiahuanaco and the Pacajes empire, all adding a little bit to Bolivia's understanding of its own heritage and history.
I'm looking forward to a wash, a shower, clean clothes and some sausages.
Tell us about your 3 days on the river, 4 days, 5 days, 6 already.